Alright, so you've unknowingly created what would come to be known as one of the pillars of survival horror, a title that would go on to cast a shadow so long that to this day, folks still look to it as a source of both inspiration and imitation. What comes next? Funny thing about that, it's easy to look at the reputation Silent Hill 2 has garnered in the years following its release and assume that it's always been this way, but that wouldn't necessarily be accurate. In fact, shortly after launch, slow sales and some negative feedback from fans in Japan gave Team Silent the opposite impression, leading them to begin development on the next title not as another slow burn, self-directed survival horror game, but rather as a rail shooter spin-off more akin to, say, House of the Dead or Time Crisis. Beginning as early as September of 2001, a team of roughly 40 people consisting of veterans returning from Silent Hill 2 along with a handful of newcomers spent the next year hammering away at this new direction. And then something changed. The decision was made to ditch the rail shooter concept in favor of a game more in line with what had come before, a new numbered entry that would instead act as a direct narrative follow-up to the first Silent Hill. As for the key personnel leading the charge, stepping into the director's chair would be Kazuhide Nakazawa, who previously worked as a character animator on Silent Hill 2. Meanwhile, old standbys like Akira Yamaoka returned as composer and sound director, in addition to adding producer to his list of titles. Hiroyuki Iwaku was back again taking on writing duties, and Masahiro Ito, who I haven't talked nearly enough about given his contributions to the series, took on a handful of roles, with the most prominent being art director and monster designer. Following its rather truncated development cycle, Silent Hill 3 launched exclusively for the PS2 between May and August of 2003, with a Windows release coming in the fall of that same year. Next time we saw it was as the second half of the Silent Hill HD collection along with Silent Hill 2, complete with a new English voice cast. Silent Hill 3 once again reviewed well, but in its launch month only sold approximately 300,000 copies, which is less than ideal. It was a stark decline from its predecessor, which had already been subject to flagging sales numbers. Of the Team Silent-led titles, Silent Hill 3 is easily the one I've heard the least about. The first game kicked things off and arguably became the foremost Resident Evil competitor. The second is the art house masterpiece that only gained more traction as the years went on. The fourth is a polarizing black sheep that sadly also acted as Team Silent's swan song. And then there's Silent Hill 3, a title that is inextricably tied to the first game with a greater focus on horror in the midst of what was a bit of a horror game slump, the boom having died down in the years since the original Resident Evil galvanized the gaming masses. I wasn't completely unfamiliar with the game. I'd seen our protagonist Heather around and knew a bit about her relation to the first game, and that the cult narrative would once again take center stage as members of the Order sought Heather out for unknown reasons. But rather than the story or gameplay, the thing I'd heard the most about was the horror, specifically in the ways it draws inspiration from sources of horror that tend to center on women. Despite not knowing nearly as much going in as I had with previous entries, the tidbits I was familiar with had me looking forward to it. The story and lore was my favorite part of the first game, and I was intrigued to see it expanded upon. And with the first two games being tense, but not necessarily what I would call scary, I was down for a more horrifying experience, especially one that seeks to present various aspects of fear commonly experienced by women. More than anything else, playing Silent Hill 3 for myself would let me see if it really is a title deserving of its somewhat quieter reputation, or if, just maybe, it deserves to stand beside its predecessor as the pinnacle of the genre. What say we head to Central Square Shopping Center and see what Heather has to say about it. But before we do, allow me a brief moment to shill this channel. Y'all know I love what I do here at llamelion Gaming, and it's a dream of mine to one day make this my full-time job. Alas, to do that, I require the assistance of all of you lovely, lovely folks watching. So if you enjoy this silly little niche of mine here on YouTube, please consider subscribing, sharing this video around, liking, commenting, you know the drill. Every little bit helps and means more than I could possibly put into words. Now, with that out of the way, let's get back to the review. Our first steps into the world of Silent Hill 3 follows Heather as she arrives at the lakeside amusement park. Encroaching darkness consumes her surroundings, rusted metal gratings, bodies strung up in cages, and the bloodied remains of numerous rabbit mascots litter the park ground, acting as her welcoming party. As Heather progresses forward, deeper into the park, she is assaulted by sound and fury, a cacophonous symphony of uncaring machinery, an eerie hum fraying the edges of her mind, and the inhuman whine of approaching beasts. Rushing past, she makes for a nearby roller coaster platform. Her only means of escape is to brave the tracks. But little does she know, the carts are running at full tilt. With no time to react, the two collide just in time for her to wake from this nightmare, having fallen asleep in a restaurant at the mall. Things seem normal. No blood or monsters to speak of. The day is winding down, the sun just starting to set as she makes her way to a payphone to let her dad know that she'll be heading home soon. Before she can hang up the phone, she's approached by a man by the name of Douglas, claiming to be a detective with information on her birth. She's not interested, but he persists, so she flees out of a bathroom window. It's here when things begin to change. Heading back into the mall, she finds it empty with most of the storefronts closed. She spots a handgun lying on the floor, and as she approaches, she finds a monster eating someone at the back of a clothing shop. It turns, having noticed Heather, and makes its way towards our protagonist, towering over her with misshapen and elongated arms. Heather, gun in hand, unloads the clip into the beast, the final bullet finishing off as the thing crumples to the ground. With the tone set, Heather slowly watches as her world continues to warp and unravel around her. She must confront forces and foes that seek to manipulate her to their own ends, as she at first seeks only to make it home to her dad in one piece and put this horrific day to bed. But none may rest once Silent Hill has taken an interest, and so she must venture into the town and put a definitive end to the plans others have laid out for her. Where the first Silent Hill was a plot-driven tale with a cast of fairly standard archetypes, and the second game eschewed plot almost entirely in favor of a purely character-focused narrative, Silent Hill 3 works to bridge the gap, providing a stronger narrative through-line fit with expanded lore and a definitive villain and supporting cast, while also applying the more nuanced approach to character development as seen in Silent Hill 2. This is especially true with regards to our lead, Heather. Heather is without a doubt my favorite character in this series thus far, a fact I don't really expect to change anytime soon, and has become one of my favorite protagonists in general. This is thanks to some truly stellar character writing, imbuing her with a wealth of personality. Where previously dialogue exchanges often saw our protagonist being a bit more dry or straightforward, and environmental interactions were almost purely informational, every exchange with Heather is very clearly written specifically with her in mind. She's scared and uncertain, but also snarky, and immediately just so done with this shit. She's not quippy, but does approach situations with a level of humor, possibly as a means of coping with insanities unfolding around her, that was missing from previous games. But even though she sometimes jokes and is generally fed up with things, that veneer quickly fades as she breaks down beneath the weight of everything she knew being so thoroughly upended in such a short span of time. Her arc is so masterfully done and comes to such a deliciously grotesque yet empowering crescendo that it's worth playing the game just to watch it unfold for yourself. To give a bit of perspective on what she goes through, Silent Hill 3 trades in themes of unwanted pregnancy and abortion, men and others attempting to control and manipulate you, religious dogma dictating what you can and cannot do with your body, stalking and obsession, as well as loss and vengeance, and whether or not one can truly be a balm for the other. And it's not just Heather either. The cast is small with maybe half a dozen key players, but each brings their own motivations and unique sort of feel to proceedings. Douglas, the previously mentioned detective, starts out as a thorn in Heather's side, but as both come to realize the stakes at play and their positions in the narrative, he ends up being a source of aid and even comfort. Claudia, the new cult leader following the events of the first game, is the one largely responsible for the hell Heather is being put through, all as a means of ushering Heather into her new role as a sort of messiah figure destined to remake the world free from human sin and anguish. Vincent, a somewhat enigmatic man and fellow cult member, has a different view on their doctrine. He rather enjoys the world as is, and so seeks to oppose Claudia's attempts to set it ablaze. Despite ostensibly being on Heather's side, there's an ominous air accompanying every scene he's in that he never manages to shake off. And that's about it. Other figures do loom large in the background, primarily through notes, diary entries, and the like, but it's these four that form the core that Silent Hill 3 revolves around. Or rather, Douglas, Claudia, and Vincent form the shell that contains the true core of the experience, that being Heather. You see, one of the most interesting narrative deviations Silent Hill 3 makes when compared to its predecessors is in the role of the protagonist. In Silent Hill 2, James isn't special, he's just another lost soul who wound up in Silent Hill. The game could have fairly easily followed Angela, for example. That is to say, each character's narrative was given roughly equal worth. You just happen to only see one of them from beginning to end. But in Silent Hill 3, every character's narrative revolves around Heather, and this acts as one of the key points of tension. Everyone involved wants something from her and acts on these wants with zero consideration for how their actions affect her. It's such a potent source of conflict and growth and is incredibly well executed. In order to accomplish this, the team did do a bit of streamlining, the most notable casualty being the multiple endings. On a first playthrough, there is only one possible outcome, and this is essentially the true ending. New Game Plus does add 2 additional endings, with one acting as a sort of alternate bad route, while the other is the tried and true joke ending. I gotta say, the joke ending this time around genuinely cracked me up, and I would be all for it acting as the canon finale for the series. I actually didn't mind just having the one main ending. In fact, I kinda prefer it. As much as I love the interpretive nature of Silent Hill 2, giving Heather a defined arc and seeing it through to its natural conclusion made for a more cohesive experience for me. Jameson's actions had to be kind of non-committal, or maybe passive is the better word, because he had to be able to fit into multiple potential reads of his character. Heather, on the other hand, is allowed to be more distinct, more of an individual with wants and needs so that she may grow and have an arc with a definitive ending. The streamlining also makes its way into the structure and pacing. Silent Hill 3 is a far more linear game than the first two, where those offered freeform exploration with town segments interspersed between key locations. Silent Hill itself only makes a couple brief appearances in the third game, and even then exploration is blocked off as the streets act more as a corridor guiding you from one location to the next. The most egregious example of this comes when Heather is tasked with visiting the lakeside amusement park first glimpsed in the opening. She's in town and begins walking in the direction of the park, but rather than hoofing it all the way there, as would have been the case in prior games, after a bit of walking, the game instead cuts to her already having arrived at the front gates. This was likely a product of the short development cycle, which also probably explains why the section of town we do see is recycled from Silent Hill 2. I don't really hold this against the game, though part of me thinks cutting the walking through town sections altogether might have been better than what is essentially a glorified cameo. But the tight, focused pacing makes for an incredibly dense game. While my final runtime only clocked in at about 6.5 hours, the more directed and persistent nature of both the gameplay and storytelling made every minute of that feel substantial, and also made for an experience laden with terror. Silent Hill 3 is constricting, with unease permeating every room and corridor. There are many factors that contribute to this, but the pacing, especially in the game's early hours, goes a long way towards establishing this sensation. Heather goes from the mall to the subway to the construction site to the office building, all before she ever steps foot onto the streets of Silent Hill. This accounted for nearly half of my playtime. That's half of the game without a chance to come up for air, without the comfort of walking out onto a foggy street. And when I at last arrived in town, I audibly sighed in relief. Everything up to that point had created this pressure bomb of nerves and mounting tension, and to finally be granted a respite was a godsend, only for it to be taken away in short order. But the pacing is just the beginning. The key to horror lies in how it is presented, what is and isn't seen or heard. And it's here that Silent Hill 3 is so far beyond any other piece of horror media that I've consumed that it's almost unfair. In my Silent Hill 2 review, one of my standout points of praise was the way darkness was used, providing a glimpse at what lay ahead, not so much so that you ever truly felt secure. Silent Hill 3 takes this concept and runs with it. Every major location is so thoroughly drenched in shadow so as to make you wonder if this world has ever truly seen the sun. Moreover, this darkness isn't cast over a decayed and dying world. Rather, since Heather spends so much time outside the confines of Silent Hill proper, when she isn't trapped in the other world, she's exploring storefronts, offices, and facilities that, under normal circumstances, would be fully occupied. This means that, for the first time in the series, the horrors once thought contained to the town are beginning to bleed out into the wider world. It makes the reality of the space feel more tangible, like these locations are actual places that exist outside of the context of this particular narrative. I did say when she isn't in the other world though. Silent Hill 3 sees the return of the rusted and corroded labyrinth of metal and blood as it was presented in the first game. Now with the power of the PS2 and a couple games worth of experience under them, the team is better able to realize this nightmare realm than ever before. And it's not just the detail in the environments or use of lighting, both of which are stellar especially considering the game is now over 20 years old, but they use these tools to present novel and interesting ways of making you uncomfortable. The most notable example of this for me came when I entered a room that was largely unassuming other than the fact that the entirety of the wall opposite the door was a mirror. Gradually, the reflection in the mirror begins to be overtaken by red veins. Then, slowly, these veins bleed out into the room itself that Heather is standing in. It was genuinely unnerving. The door locks behind you and you can't leave until you fully transition to the other world. Despite there being no overt threat to Heather, the sequence had me panicking and wanting me to escape the room as quickly as possible. But there's more to an environment than just the space you're in. There are also those things that occupy it. So what of the creatures stalking these halls that Heather must confront if she is to endure her ordeal? If you've seen my previous Silent Hill videos, you'll know that this has been somewhat of a sore spot for me, as I felt previous entries were both lacking variety and at times suffered from bland creature designs. Silent Hill 3 at last remedies these issues. The diversity of enemy types has increased to the point that some foes seen early in the adventure get phased out by the second half, something that wasn't really possible with previous games. And the designs themselves are gorgeously upsetting. They play with size much more this time around, with some creatures like the Closer in Insane Cancer dwarfing Heather, making her feel small, almost insignificant against the obstacles she faces. Others like the Pendulum and Slurper are nigh inscrutable at first blush, a mess of limbs and meat scuttling and screaming as they close in on her location. Silent Hill 3 also sees the formal return of bosses. While technically there in the second game, they were so downplayed in favor of focusing on Pyramid Head that I kinda forgot about them. Silent Hill 3, meanwhile, makes a show of each boss, and deservedly so, as they have some of the best designs in the game. My favorites are the, let's say, mildly phallic Splitworm and the final boss, which I won't be spoiling here. These creatures and environments, no matter how intricately crafted or grotesque, would inevitably falter if the sound design wasn't on point. Lucky for us, this is, in my estimation, the best sound design in the series thus far. Much of the game is shrouded in silence, with only Heather's footsteps and the odd environmental detail to keep you company. It's only when danger draws near that the world becomes a cacophonous distortion of reality, bombarding you with everything from the crackle of static to the uncanny mewling of the numb bodies to the high-pitched whine of the pendulums. But it's not just the enemies, as Yamaoka adds additional layers to those you've come to expect. A standout for me was this persistent sort of hum underlying some combat encounters. It brings to mind the image of a child rocking back and forth, eyes closed, doing their damnedest to drown out the horrors around them. It's evocative and anxiety-inducing, and just recalling it sets me on edge. As with the pacing and structure, there is a bit of give and take. While the sound design is arguably the best it's ever been, the soundtrack takes a bit of a back seat reserved primarily for cutscenes. I wouldn't call this a negative, rather it gives cutscenes and gameplay distinct identities, the former acting as a marker of narrative and character progression, while the latter centers on conveying the horror of the situation directly to the player. Where sound design for gameplay is about stress and uncertainty, tracks during cutscenes are almost nostalgic, even patient, with long build-ups and an overall more grounded feel compared to, say, Silent Hill 2's dreamlike compositions. A good example of this comes with an early highlight, End of Small Sanctuary. This track plays just before things take a turn when Heather is still just an ordinary teenager spending a day out at the mall. It captures the sensation of being on summer break, making the most of those final moments of unencumbered freedom before adulthood sets in. Last as far as audio goes is the voices, and this particular cast turns in some excellent performances. Heather Morris, aptly portraying our lead Heather, is a large part of why I love her character so much. She manages to capture the attitude you expect from a teenager without being annoying or overbearing, while also just as capable at capturing Heather's pain, confusion, and anger as things steadily spiral further with seemingly very little that Heather can do about it.
Wait! I'm not finished talking!
I knew you were on her side.
How do you figure?
There's something wrong with you too.
Donna Burke returns following her stint as Angela in the previous game, this time portraying Claudia, a much different kind of character. Contrary to Angela's shy stammering, Claudia is determined, undaunted in her confidence as our lead villain, and Burke brings a level of believability to her at times dramatic religious musings. The two odd ones out are Richard Gross as Douglas and Clifford Ripple as Vincent. I say odd not because I find their performances lacking, but more so because compared to our leading ladies, they go for a different style of performance. Douglas has a soft-spoken manner with an odd rhythm to his line delivery that on first read felt subpar. As the game progressed, the delivery lended a sort of bumbling earnestness to the character, with Gross's performance being what ultimately endeared him to me. Vincent, on the other hand, comes off as a slimeball from minute one, and Ripple leans hard into this, hamming it up with his delivery. It contrasts with Morris and Burke's nuanced performances for Heather and Claudia respectively, but is fitting for the character, even if conversations with him can at times come off as incongruous. That said, when the script leans into the menacing aspects of his character, Ripple's performance truly shines, with one particular exchange between him and Heather giving us one of the best scenes in the game.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
gameplay in Silent Hill 3 echoes much of what came before, with a handful of small additions and refinements, but the way it differs is in how the pieces all fit together in order to reinforce the game's themes. Just to get this out of the way, separate difficulties for combat and puzzles return once more, and as you might expect based on my prior visits to Silent Hill, I ran with easy for combat and normal for puzzles. One difference compared to previous games is the role that combat plays and the way in which the game is balanced to incentivize that role. You are encouraged to engage in combat as little as possible. Enemies, especially larger foes, can soak up a good number of hits before going down. Because of this, I frequently swap between weapons in an effort to conserve resources, particularly bullets, which are far scarcer here than in previous games, and because of the way certain enemies feel geared more towards melee rather than guns, and vice versa. Closers, for example, with their long reach and needle-like attack can dish out some serious pain and are best dealt with from afar, while something like the double head are weaker and easily distracted, making them simple to bludgeon to death with melee. That's another new addition. Heather occasionally comes across pieces of beef jerky which can be used to distract certain enemies, allowing her to sneak past or opening them up to the aforementioned bludgeoning. Later in the game, they also begin varying up enemy compositions. Typically, when I'd seen groups of enemies in previous Silent Hills, they were all the same type, but here I found several occasions where a slurper was in the same area as, say, a nurse or a scraper. It's a minor thing, but combined with the way different enemies encourage switching up your playstyle, it kept me on my toes and combat fresh. This may be more common on higher difficulty, so it's probably not actually new to the series, but this was the first I'd seen it. There were really only two faults I had with the combat and enemies. The first was the slurper. While I dig the design of a weird little man crawling around with a big ol' anteater nose, the fact that they're low to the ground makes them a serious pain to take out with melee. Now, normally I just opt for firearms in this situation, but they're a fairly common enemy type, especially later in the game when I was steadily becoming more conscious of my dwindling ammo supply, resulting in my sticking with melee despite it being less than ideal. The second was that while they sport some terrific and terrifying designs, I found the actual act of fighting the bosses to be underwhelming. Even playing on easy, I found their health pools negligible and attack patterns overly simplistic. The sole exception to this was the final boss, which, while still not particularly complex, at least dealt out decent damage and took a fair few hits before going down. To fill in the gaps between demon slicing action, Silent Hill 3 also provides players with plenty of puzzles barring Heather's progress. One thing I forgot to mention in my Silent Hill 2 video that carries over into the third game is that the player character will now look in the direction of items and enemies while exploring. I love this feature. It cuts down the amount of backtracking and spamming the X button on everything in a room just in case you miss something, while also making sense contextually. I noticed three pervading puzzle types during my playthrough. The first was also present in Silent Hill 2, and their overuse was a contributing factor to that game's puzzles being somewhat forgettable. They are what I like to call kitchen sink puzzles. This type requires you to comb the environment, tracking down every key item in an area and then tossing them together to make the solution. No real thought is required, and as such they're not really puzzles, more just scavenger hunts. So long as you found everything, they ultimately solve themselves. The second type is what I like to call obstruction puzzles. Heather is occasionally presented with a threat or obstacle, such as a room full of bugs or a creature hidden in water. She needs to locate the necessary items to solve the puzzle before then using them in the correct way to remove the obstruction. I like these a lot as they feel more intuitive, as though Heather is actively using her surroundings to devise a solution MacGyver style. Last are the instruction puzzles. For these, Heather's presented with, say, a keypad and must suss out the correct order of operations, in this example a passcode, by using a list of instructions she's been presented with. While infrequent, these were hands down the best puzzles in the game for me. The few times they did show up had me pulling out the pencil and paper to work out the solutions by hand, which I hadn't done since the first game. On the whole, I found the puzzles both memorable and engaging without ever becoming tedious or obtuse. There's a good deal of variety and enough challenge that I occasionally had to stop and think without ever requiring outside assistance. If I haven't made it clear up to this point, I really like this game. The balance of character and plot, strength of Heather as a protagonist, expansion on the Silent Hill lore, truly unsettling sound and enemy design, refinements and balances of the combat, and puzzle variety all made for such a cohesive package that Silent Hill 3 is as close to a perfect horror experience that I've had the pleasure of playing. Unfortunately, all of the things that make me love Silent Hill 3 also kind of work against it when it comes to recommending the game. While Silent Hill 2 is a horror game, the focus was so heavily placed on the characters and the horror aspects felt light enough that I was comfortable giving it a blanket recommendation. For Silent Hill 3, the horror is integral to the experience. Where James faced a hell of his own making, Heather's is one that was forced upon her, so the scares and tension are ramped up, making it much more difficult for me to recommend, especially to folks sensitive to that kind of thing. And as has become the norm of this channel, getting your hands on a copy is going to set you back more than I'd say is reasonable. An original PS2 copy runs around $200 USD at the low end. I haven't heard as much negativity surrounding the version included in the Silent Hill HD collection, the alternate voice cast notwithstanding, and I've seen copies of that hovering around $30 USD, but seeing as my only experience with this game is the PS2 version, I can't personally speak to the quality of the HD port. That means that, once again, until Konami decides to port or remake the game for modern hardware, you're better off emulating this one. Bearing all of that in mind, Silent Hill 3 is still receiving my highest recommendation, just with the caveat that, especially coming off of Silent Hill 2, you need to know what you're getting into. This is a scary game, but it's also one that's deserving of your time. It embraces realms of horror not often explored in games, and even less often handled this well. So yes, you really should play or watch Silent Hill 3. Trust me, it'll be worth it. James has had more than enough time in the sun. It's about time we give Heather her due. And with that, thank you all so much for watching and sticking around to the end. Boy, was this harder for me to write than I thought it would be. It's always the games I end up loving the most that I struggle with when writing a review. Anywho, as always, please take care of yourselves and each other, and next time we'll be wrapping up this trip to Silent Hill with a stop at the South Ashfield Heights apartment complex. I wish I could say this was gonna be a good time.